Rain had been falling over the village of Ashcroft Hollow for 3 days without ceasing, the kind of steady, purposeful rain that softened the edges of stone walls and turned the lane into a mirror. It drummed against the low casement windows of the schoolroom, ran in clean lines down the glass, and gathered in the ruts outside where the carter's wheels had pressed deep into the mud. Inside, where a single fire burned, and 14 children sat in rows with their slates, the air smelled of wet wool and chalk dust, and the particular warmth of small bodies in a confined space. And at the edge of all that concentrated, purposeful quiet, standing at the blackboard with a stick of chalk and the complete attention of 14 pairs of eyes, was Cordelia Ashton. She had written a column of figures on the board, not for arithmetic, though the older children would copy them for practice later, but to demonstrate proportion, because she had discovered that children who could not grasp fractions in the abstract grasped them immediately when the figures represented something real. Today they represented the village's monthly flour supply and its distribution across 12 households. The children were not supposed to find this interesting. They found it riveting. The boy in the second row, a miller's son named Peter, had already corrected her division twice, and both times he had been right. Again, she said, and pointed to the second figure. She had been in Ashcroft Hollow for 14 months. She had arrived with a leather traveling trunk, a letter of reference from a solicitor in London whose name she had never expected to use, and the precise, organized calm of a woman who had decided, once and finally, that she was going to stop waiting for the world to notice what she could do, and simply do it somewhere it was needed. She had not expected to be happy. She had expected to be competent, which she had always been, and useful, which she could manage, and eventually, in some quiet way, perhaps at peace. Happiness had not been part of the calculation. It had arrived anyway, incrementally, in the way that all real things arrive, not announced but accumulated, the way a bridge is built not by the last bolt, but by every bolt before it. She had not expected anyone to come looking for her. The chalk moved across the board in a clean, straight line. Peter's hand was already up. Julian Ashford, the Duke of Wrentham, had been searching for 3 months. His secretary, a precise man named Thomas Carey, who had worked for the Wrentham estate for 11 years and prided himself on finding things, had located her twice, once in Bath, which turned out to be a different Cordelia Ashton entirely, a widow of 60, with a small dog she called Sovereign, and once in a village outside Shrewsbury, which had also proven incorrect. The third report had come from a solicitor in London whose correspondence, when examined carefully, pointed to a corner of the North Riding of Yorkshire, where a newly established schoolroom had opened, in a converted millworker's cottage, and was apparently running at a level of organizational efficiency that had astonished the local magistrate, 2 churchwardens, and the blacksmith, who had publicly declared that the new schoolmistress was the cleverest person he had ever met, and he had once spoken to a barrister. Julian had read this report standing at his writing desk in the library of Wrentham House, in the cold London rain of early March 1817, and had not moved for a long time. Then he had put the report in the top drawer of the desk, and stood with his hands flat on the surface of the wood, and looked at the window for the better part of an hour. His secretary had not disturbed him. Thomas Carey had worked for the estate long enough to understand that the Duke's stillness was not absence but decision. The next morning, Julian had left for Yorkshire. To understand what Cordelia Ashton had built in Ashcroft Hollow, and why the building of it mattered, it was necessary to understand what she had come from. This was not a story she told often, or in full, because it was not a story with a clean center. It was a story about invisible work, which is to say it was a story about the kind of labor that leaves no record, because the people who benefit from it prefer not to acknowledge the debt. Her father, Mr. Edward Ashton, had been a man of modest income and immoderate optimism, a combination that had served him adequately until his death in the autumn of 1811, when Cordelia was 19. He had managed a small estate in Hertfordshire, not his own estate, but that of his elder brother, George Ashton, whose principal qualification for ownership was birth order, and whose principal occupation was spending 2 seasons a year in London doing nothing of particular use. The arrangement had been understood, if not formalized. Edward managed the tenants, the accounts, the harvest schedules, and the creditor negotiations. George signed the letters. When Edward died, of a fever that arrived on a Tuesday and concluded everything by Friday, the arrangement collapsed. George came down from London, looked at the accounts, understood approximately 70% of what he was reading, and turned to Cordelia, who was the only person standing in the estate office who understood the other 30. She had been helping her father since she was 15. Not in the manner of a dutiful daughter reading over his shoulder, but in the manner of an apprentice who had grasped the work faster than the master expected, and been given more of it accordingly. By 17, she had been managing the household accounts herself. By 18, she had renegotiated the terms of a grain supply agreement with a merchant in St. Albans that saved the estate £11 annually, a figure her father had mentioned to her in private and to no one else. Because a girl of 18 negotiating commercial terms was a detail that created more questions than it answered. When George looked at the accounts and turned to her, she had told him what she knew. George had nodded, patted her hand, and hired a man from Hartford to manage the estate. The man from Hartford had lasted 4 months before George, reviewing a set of accounts that were suddenly and mysteriously worse, had turned to Cordelia again. This time she had asked, very quietly and with complete precision, what he intended to offer her. George had been surprised. He had mentioned a small allowance, her continued residence in the house, and the vague possibility that he might help her find a suitable situation in due course. Cordelia had accepted the allowance, which was not large but was better than nothing, and had not mentioned the question of a suitable situation again, because she had understood by then that George would remember this promise with the exact same reliability with which he had always remembered anything that cost him something. For 4 years she had managed the Ashton estate under George's name. She had done this not from resignation, but from a specific calculation. She needed the experience to become so demonstrably capable that, when she eventually left, no one could pretend she had not existed. She had learned the grain markets, the wool trade, the mechanics of tenant negotiation, and the specific language of creditor correspondence that accomplished in a letter what would have required a barrister if written less precisely. She had recovered the estate from the deficit the man from Hertford had left, and returned it to profit within 14 months. She had then, over 2 subsequent years, restructured 4 of the major supply agreements, reducing the annual outlay by £60 and improving the quality of 2 of the inputs. She had kept detailed records of all of it, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had understood, with a clarity that arrived early and never left, that the only record that mattered was the one you could produce. The moment she had almost broken, and had chosen not to, came in the winter of 1814, when George had brought a cousin from London to review the accounts, and the cousin had sat across from her at the estate office table, and talked to George as though Cordelia were not in the room, addressing questions to George that George could not answer, receiving the answers from George after George had glanced sideways at her, and she had said them quietly enough that the cousin could pretend they came from George. She had sat through this for an hour. She had not raised her voice. She had not pushed back her chair in fury, or allowed her face to show the thing that was moving through her chest like a stone through still water. She had pressed one hand briefly, once, flat against the surface of the table under the pretense of steadying her papers, and she had continued. She had told herself, in that moment, with the clarity of someone making a decision and not taking it back, I am not going to become less than I am for the convenience of people who need me to be less. She had gone home that evening and begun writing to a solicitor in London about the possibilities for a woman of her particular experience and requirements. She had spent the following 2 years building the case for her departure, with the same methodical attention she had given to everything else. She had arrived at Wrentham House in the spring of 1815, as a guest of Lady Margaret Ashford, Julian's aunt, who had known Cordelia's mother before her death, and who had extended an invitation that Cordelia had understood to be genuine and had accepted carefully, with clear expectations of its scope. She had not expected Julian. That was perhaps the most honest thing she could say about it. She had not expected him to notice her, and she had not expected, when he did, to find that she did not know what to do with being seen. She had left in January of 1816, on a grey morning when the frost still covered the grass of the south lawn, and the house was not yet fully awake. She had left a letter for Lady Margaret. she had not left one for Julian. She had not known, then, what she was stepping away from. Or perhaps she had known, and had not trusted it enough to stay. Julian Ashford had been 29 when Cordelia left Wrentham House, and he had been, if anyone had pressed him to describe himself honestly, a man still in the early stages of learning to occupy his own life. He had become Duke of Wrentham at 22, upon the death of his father, a man who had been cold in the manner of a lock without a key, orderly and impenetrable, and had spent the 7 years since then managing an estate of considerable complexity and a social position of considerable demand, with the same focused efficiency that he brought to everything, which was to say, competently, and at a distance from his own center. His mother had died when he was 11. This was not, in itself, an uncommon loss for a man of his era and position. What was perhaps less common was that his mother had been the only person in the household who had spoken to him as though what he thought mattered. She had been a musician, not a drawing-room amateur but a genuine musician, someone who had practiced scales in the morning room at 6:30 and could sight-read a Bach partita, and had once, when Julian was 9, explained to him the structural logic of a fugue, in terms he had never forgotten. "You begin with a single true thing," she had said, "and you carry it through every variation the world can throw at it, and if the original thing was actually true, it holds. Everything that sounds like chaos is just the original true thing being tested." He had thought about this more than he had ever told anyone. His mother had also, over the course of her marriage, kept a set of estate accounts of her own, a parallel record, meticulous and private, that Julian had discovered at 23 in a locked drawer of the morning room desk. He had read them over 3 evenings, sitting in the chair where she used to sit with her music, and had understood from them several things about his father's financial management that the official records had not made clear, and also, more quietly, something about his mother's quality of mind. He had never discussed this discovery with anyone until the evening in October 1815, when he had found Cordelia Ashton in the Wrentham House library at 10:30 at night, working through a discrepancy in his estate accounts that his own steward had not found. She had not been invited to do this. She had been a house guest, a connection of his aunt's, a woman he had placed in the category of polite visitor and had not yet examined more carefully. She was standing at the library table with her traveling writing case open and a candle pulled close, and the quarterly accounts spread before her, in a pattern that was not the pattern his steward used, a different arrangement, one that isolated the variable figures from the fixed ones, in a way that made the discrepancy immediately visible once you looked at it correctly. He had stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. She did not startle in the usual way. She turned, looked at him with the particular stillness of a person who has been caught doing something they are not ashamed of, and said, "There is a difference of £22 and 11 shillings in the 3rd quarter woolens account. I believe the merchant in Leeds has been submitting 2 sets of figures, but I would need your steward's correspondence ledger to confirm it." Julian had looked at her for a long time. Then he had pulled the second chair to the table and sat down. They had worked through it together until 2 in the morning. The discrepancy was confirmed. The merchant in Leeds, when subsequently confronted with both sets of figures, had returned £44 and accepted a revised agreement without further argument. Julian's steward, who was a decent man but not a detailed one, had been quietly grateful rather than embarrassed, which said something good about him. Julian had not spoken to Cordelia about this afterward, in any way that named it for what it was. He had been, he understood in retrospect, still learning to see what he was looking at. He had assigned Thomas Carey to quietly gather information, not as an act of surveillance but as an act of genuine attention. The first such act he had directed at another person, in longer than he could easily recall. What Thomas had found over the following weeks had made Julian sit with the morning room window for the better part of a second long evening. She had managed the Ashton estate under her uncle's name for 4 years. She had recovered it from deficit, restructured its supply agreements, and kept every record. She had done this without credit, without title, and without complaint, not because she was resigned to it, but because she had decided it was worth doing, and had done it. He had attended 3 more dinners at which she was present. At each one, he had asked her a question that required a real answer, not a social one. She had given him real answers. with a directness that no one else in those rooms would have managed, and had then, each time, returned her attention to whatever she had been doing before he spoke, as though his title did not require her to stay more attentive to him than the situation warranted. He had found this, privately, extraordinary. He had also found, with increasing clarity, that when Cordelia Ashton left a room, the room was less well organized. He had not said any of this. He had not known, then, how to begin. He was a man who had been trained from 11 to manage, not to ask, and asking for something he did not yet know how to name was beyond him. He had held the intention in the manner of a careful man holding something fragile, firmly enough not to drop it, gently enough not to break it. She had left before he found the words. He had found them in the 3 months since. They were not eloquent words, they were specific ones. The road into Ashcroft Hollow was not built for a ducal traveling coach, a fact that Julian's coachman noted 3 separate times, with increasing pointedness, as the wheels found the ruts, and the mud made its opinion known. Julian sat in the coach with the Thomas Carey report in his hand, reading it for the 4th time, and watched the village come into view through the rain-blurred window, a grey stone church, a scatter of cottages, a blacksmith's yard, and, at the top of the slight rise on the east side of the lane, a converted building with firelight visible through its 2 low windows, and a board above the door that read, in clean painted letters, Ashcroft Free School. He told the coachman to stop at the inn. The inn was small, and the innkeeper was curious, and Julian offered nothing to satisfy the curiosity except the name Carey, which Thomas had arranged in advance, and a request for a room for 2 nights. The innkeeper provided both and asked no further questions, which suggested he was either discreet or distracted. Julian went to his room, removed his coat, and stood at the window looking at the rain. He had not considered, precisely, what he would say. He had considered it considerably less than Cordelia would have, which was a gap he intended to acknowledge when the time came, because she deserved someone who was honest about the difference. What he had was not a speech. It was a list of true things, which was, he supposed, the only instrument he had ever trusted. Charlotte Pierce had been Cordelia's first genuine ally in Ashcroft Hollow, arriving 6 weeks after Cordelia herself in the capacity of the village vicar's youngest daughter, a position that gave her access to everyone and particular authority over no one, which she seemed to find entirely satisfactory. She was 24, practical, and possessed of an absolute inability to pretend she found something interesting when she did not. A quality that had initially surprised Cordelia, and then made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could calculate, that she was in a room with someone who would tell her the truth. Charlotte had been the one to find the schoolroom building, to negotiate its rental from the mill owner's estate, and to threaten the mill owner's estate manager with a letter to the church vestry when the rental price was raised without notice. She had been the one to recruit the 14 children, to persuade 5 of their fathers that a schoolmistress was not a suspicious appointment, and to arrive on the first morning with a basket of bread and a completely unembellished statement that she was there because she thought the school was the best thing that had happened to the village in 10 years, and she intended to see it succeed. She had also been, from the beginning, the person who noticed things. Charlotte noticed that Cordelia worked from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. She noticed that Cordelia spent her own small savings on schoolroom supplies before she spent anything on herself. She noticed that Cordelia never spoke of London, or of anyone in London, except in the most general terms, and that when certain topics arose, estate management, aristocratic households, the particular domestic arrangements of ducal families, Cordelia's expression went very still, in the way that an old door goes still in a cold wind, not locked, but held. "You managed someone's estate," Charlotte said, one evening, over tea, without preamble. "I managed my uncle's estate," Cordelia said, "for 4 years." "Someone else's estate," Charlotte said, with a precision that made Cordelia look at her. "Yes," Cordelia said, after a moment. Charlotte had not pressed. She had refilled the tea and said, "The magistrate wants to know if you'd be willing to advise on the road repair financing. He says he's been trying to understand the figures for 3 months, and can't make them balance." Cordelia had agreed to look at the figures. She had found the problem in 20 minutes. A surveyor's invoice had been entered twice in the expenditure ledger, which had created an apparent deficit that had been stopping the project for a quarter. She had presented the corrected figures to the magistrate, a man named Alistair Webb, who was honest, methodical, and utterly at sea with anything more complex than simple addition. He had stared at the correction for some time, then looked at her with an expression she recognized. Not admiration exactly, but the particular recalibration of a person who has just been shown something they did not know they were missing. "You had better come to the next vestry meeting," he said. She had been to every vestry meeting since. She had also, over the course of 14 months, reorganized the village's charitable fund distribution, identified and corrected a surveying error that had been incorrectly charging 3 tenant farmers for land that was not theirs, and drafted a proposal for a lending library that the vicar had taken to the local gentry with considerably more success than he had expected. The elder of the 2 churchwardens, a retired wool factor named Daniel Purvis, who had spent 40 years in trade and recognized organized thinking when he saw it, had told her, without ceremony, that she was wasted running a schoolroom and ought to be running a county. She had thanked him and returned to her list. It was Daniel Purvis who came to the schoolroom door on the 4th day of the rain, while the children were working at their slates, and knocked in his specific, deliberate way. 3 even strokes, the way a man knocks when he has something to say and intends to say it plainly. Cordelia set down her chalk and went to the door. "There is a man at the inn," Daniel said without greeting, in the manner of someone who considered social preliminaries a form of inefficiency. "Arrived yesterday in a coach that does not belong in this lane. Name of Carey, Thomas Carey." Cordelia looked at him. "Thomas Carey is a secretary," she said, "to the Duke of Wrentham." "That," said Daniel, "is the information I could not account for until this moment." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has assembled a puzzle and finds the final piece both satisfying and troubling. "Shall I send him away?" "No," Cordelia said. She was quiet for a moment, looking past Daniel at the rain on the lane. "No, thank you, Daniel." She returned to the schoolroom, where 14 children were still working with commendable concentration, and stood for a moment with her hand against the doorframe. Then she picked up her chalk and returned to the board. He came in the afternoon. She had known he would not send Thomas. She had known, the moment Daniel named the connection, that Julian would come himself, because Julian Ashford was a man who did not delegate the things that mattered to him. She had learned this from observation, not from anything he had said, over the months at Wrentham House when she had watched him manage a household of 30, and an estate of thousands with the same quiet, direct authority, never performing, never deferring what he could address, never asking someone else to stand in the place where he should stand. She had not known, for certain, that she mattered to him in that particular way. She had suspected, she had been afraid of the suspicion. She was marking the children's slates when the door opened. The children looked up. She did not look up immediately. She finished the correction she was making, wrote the note beside it, and set the slate down. Then she turned. Julian Ashford stood in the doorway of the Ashcroft Free School, in a greatcoat that had been thoroughly defeated by the rain, his dark hair wet at the edges, with the expression of a man who has traveled 3 days and found what he was looking for, and is now making his internal accounting in real time. He looked exactly like himself, contained, precise, and, at this particular moment, stripped of every social veneer by the sheer physical fact of Yorkshire in March. 14 children stared at him with unanimous interest. "Good afternoon," he said. He said it to Cordelia, not to the room, although he included the room in the acknowledgement in the way that a person does when they understand that the room comes with the person. "Good afternoon," Cordelia said. She looked at the class. "You may close your slates. We will continue the proportion work tomorrow." There was a brief interval of slate closing and coat finding, during which Julian stood in the doorway, and the children filed past him with varying degrees of curiosity and courage, and one small girl stopped in front of him, looked directly up at his face, and said, "Are you a duke?" "I am," Julian said. The girl considered this. "You're wet," she said, and went out. When the room was empty, Cordelia stood at the board and looked at him. The fire had burned low, and the rain against the windows was very loud, and the room smelled of chalk and wood smoke, and the particular cold that comes through old stone walls in wet weather. "You found me," she said. "It took 3 months," he said. "I should have found you sooner." He paused. "That is not a reproach. It is an accounting." She moved to the fireplace and added 2 pieces of wood from the stack beside it. The fire caught and the light improved. She did not invite him to sit, not because she did not want him to, but because she needed another moment to gather herself before what was coming, and activity was, as it had always been, the instrument she trusted. "Charlotte thinks I should hear you out," she said, without turning. She said, and I am quoting precisely, that a man who searches 3 counties in winter is either genuinely sorry or deranged, and that I looked too sensible to have been involved with the deranged sort. "I have not been to 3 counties," he said. "I have been to 4. Bath was a particular disappointment." She turned then, because she could not help it. He did not smile, not fully. Julian Ashford's version of a smile was a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, and a change in the quality of his eyes. But she knew what she was looking at, and it did the thing to her chest that she had been trying not to anticipate since Daniel Purvis knocked on the door. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You do not owe me anything," she said. "We were not." She stopped. "We were not," he agreed. "But we should have been. That is what I owe you the explanation for." She sat down at one of the children's benches, because standing was requiring more effort than it should, and he drew a chair from beside the door, a chair too small for him, which he sat in anyway with complete unself-consciousness, folding himself into it and resting his elbows on his knees, in a way she had never seen him sit in public, because he would never have sat like that in public. This was Julian Ashford, without the architecture of his position, which was a Julian Ashford she had only seen once before, at 2 in the morning over the Leeds Woolens account, and which still undid her in exactly the ways she had been trying to manage for over a year. "I let you leave," he said, "because I had not yet found the words, and I told myself that finding the words would take a week, perhaps 2, and that I would write. I did not write. I told myself it would be better to speak in person, and I found reasons: the estate accounts, the spring tenancy negotiations, a matter with the Wrentham Trust that took until June to resolve. By the time I had resolved it, 6 months had passed." He looked at her steadily. "I am not presenting these as justifications. I am presenting them as the record, which is what I imagine you would want." She considered this. He was right that she would want the record. She had always wanted the record. "What changed in October?" she asked, because she had calculated from Thomas Carey's known movements that the search had begun in October. "I went into the library," he said, "at 10:30. Out of habit, I think, or something that behaved like habit. I sat down at the table where you had worked and I understood, clearly, what I had let go of. Not in a general sense, in a specific one. £22 and 11 shillings in the Woolens account." "That is not a romantic formulation," she said. "No," he said, "but it is the true one. You walked into my library at 10:30 at night, and you showed me something that my own steward had missed for 8 months, and you showed it to me as though it were simply the obvious thing that needed doing. And I sat with you until 2 in the morning, and you never once made me feel that my ignorance of it was a fault. You just corrected it. That was when I knew." He paused. "I should have said so then. I did not know how." The fire was burning well now, rain on the glass. The chalk-dusted board behind her still had the column of proportion figures she had been explaining to Peter when the day had taken its turn. "I left," she said, "because I was not certain you saw me. Not Cordelia Ashton, George Ashton's invisible estate manager, who had spent 4 years being useful and uncredited. I was not certain whether what you were seeing was me or the function." "I know," he said. "That is the part I failed. I had seen you. I had Thomas compile a complete record of what you had built. I read it twice. I sat with it and understood exactly what it cost you, and what quality of person it required, and I still did not tell you, because I was—" He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment. "My mother used to say that the original true thing has to hold through every variation. I had not yet learned to be certain mine would hold." She looked at him. She had not expected him to name his mother. She had not expected him to reach for that particular structure, the fugue he had described to her once, briefly, during an evening when the conversation had gone somewhere neither of them had planned. She had carried that conversation for 14 months like a stone in a pocket, not heavy, but always there, always exactly where she put it. "It holds," she said. She said it simply, without ceremony, because it was the simple, exact truth. He did not say anything. He simply reached across the small distance between the child's chair and the child's bench, and took her hand, her bare hand, because her gloves were on the table behind her, and held it with a care that was not tentative and not possessive but settled, like something that had finally arrived at the place it was supposed to be. They sat in the schoolroom of the Ashcroft Free School for a while, in the rain, with the fire and the chalk-dusted board, and the proportion figures still waiting on the slate. It was Charlotte who solved the practical problem, as Charlotte generally solved practical problems, with efficiency and a complete absence of sentimentality about the solution. "If he is proposing to take you back to Wrentham," she said the following morning, sitting across from Cordelia at the kitchen table, with the directness of someone who had decided that ceremony would waste time they didn't have, "then you need to understand what you would be agreeing to before you agree to it. Not romantically, I mean practically." "I know what I would be agreeing to," Cordelia said. "You know what the position is," Charlotte said. "I want to know if you know what you want from it, which is different." She looked at Cordelia over her cup. "You built this school, you wrote the lending library proposal, you corrected the road accounts that have been wrong for 3 years. You are not a decorative accessory to a ducal household. What does he understand about that?" "More than most men would," Cordelia said. "That is a low standard," Charlotte said, without heat. "It is," Cordelia agreed. "He is above it." Charlotte considered this. "All right," she said, "then what does he intend to offer you?" Julian had, in fact, already addressed this question, not with Charlotte, who he had not yet met in a formal way, but with Cordelia herself, in the second conversation they had had, also in the schoolroom, also by the fire, the morning after the first. He had arrived at 8:30 with a proposal that was orderly and specific and presented not as a favor but as a negotiated position, which was, Cordelia understood, his particular dialect of respect. He wished to marry her. He was aware this created several structural problems, principal among them his estate solicitor, a man named Geoffrey Hartwell who had been advising the Wrentham family for 30 years and who held strong views about the appropriate social origins of a duchess. He was also aware that his social circle contained individuals who would find Cordelia's background insufficient, chief among them Lord Ramsgate, the Earl of Moorfield, who had been a friend of Julian's father and who considered himself a guardian of the family's interests in the absence of the late Duke. He was prepared to address both of these obstacles, but he wanted her to be under no illusion about their existence. He had then, and this was the moment that Cordelia had returned to several times in the 24 hours since, placed on the schoolroom table a single folded document and said, "I also want you to know what I am asking you to come back to." She had unfolded it. It was a proposed amendment to the Wrentham estate stewardship arrangement, specific, legally framed, requiring the signature of the Duke and the estate solicitor, that would formalize Cordelia's oversight of the estate accounts in her own name, with a salary, a defined scope of authority, and a right of direct correspondence with the estate's principal creditors and suppliers. Not because he wanted her as a steward, because he understood that she had been doing this work for years without formal acknowledgement, and because he intended to be the first person who put her name on the record that matched her labor. She had read it twice. She had found one clause she wanted to revise, the corresponding authority section, which was slightly too narrow in its language to cover the kind of supply renegotiation she had done in Hertfordshire, and she had told him so. He had read the clause, agreed with her assessment, and made the amendment in his own hand on the document while she watched. "You've been holding this for some time," she said. "I drafted it in November," he said. Thomas helped with the legal language. He paused. "I hoped I would find you in time to make it relevant." She had folded the document and held it for a moment, thinking. She was not going to answer immediately. She owed herself the full consideration, because the decision she was making was not small, and because she had learned, at some expense, that rushing towards something without examining it first was not a virtue but an evasion. "I need a week," she said. He had nodded, without argument or urgency. "I will be at the inn," he said. "Take what you need." The week had been occupied with Charlotte, who asked pointed questions, with Daniel Purvis, who asked broader ones, with the magistrate, Alistair Webb, who said nothing but listened carefully, when she told him she might be leaving, and then said that the school would need a proper governance structure if it was to continue without her, and that he thought they could write one. And with Cordelia herself, who worked through the question the way she worked through every question, methodically, with all the information on the table, looking at what it would cost, and what it would give, and whether the ground she was standing on was solid. The school was the thing she kept returning to. She had built it from nothing. She had 14 children, and an arrangement with the mill owner's estate, and a lending library proposal that was halfway to being funded. She was not going to leave it for a future she couldn't see clearly. But she was also, she admitted to herself on the fourth evening, not being asked to abandon it. She was being asked to extend it, to carry what she had built here into a larger context, with a partner who had, unlike everyone else she had ever worked alongside, put her name on the paper. She had walked up to the inn on the 6th morning. Julian was sitting in the inn's single public room with Thomas Carey and a set of estate correspondence, which he closed when she came in, not with the hastiness of a man concealing something, but with the deliberateness of a man who understood that whatever she was coming to say was more important than the quarterly accounts. "Yes," she said, with the revised clause. He looked at her for a moment, and in the quality of that look was everything he had not found words for in the autumn of 1815, and had found, she believed, somewhere between Bath and Yorkshire in the winter of 1817. "The revised clause stands," he said. "I told the solicitor last week." She sat down at the table. Thomas Carey produced a second cup of tea from somewhere, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been anticipating this outcome, and had prepared accordingly. "The school stays open," she said. "We will fund it," Julian said. "From the estate charitable allocation. Charlotte Pierce, if she is willing, as the acting director. She will want to negotiate the terms," Cordelia said. "I would expect no less," he said. She looked at him across the table. £22 and 11 shillings in the Leeds Woolens account. A fugue that held its original true thing through every variation. A contract clause amended in his own hand. She picked up the tea. The wedding took place in May, in London, at a church in Mayfair that had been used by the Wrentham family for 3 generations. It was attended by 200 people, the majority of whom had formed a variety of opinions about the match, and kept most of them to themselves, as people generally do when the power in a room is arranged in a way that makes opinion-keeping the more comfortable option. Lady Serena Holt, the daughter of Lord Ramsgate, and the woman who had been the subject of quiet discussion as a more appropriate candidate for the Duchess of Wrentham position, attended the ceremony in a gown of pale yellow that was everything appropriate, and was seated 3 rows from the front. She watched the proceedings with the expression of someone who had revised their understanding of a situation and was still completing the revision. She was, Cordelia understood without drama, not a villain. She was a woman who had been positioned by the machinery of her world to expect something, and the machinery had, for once, failed to deliver it. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply not been what Julian was looking for, which was not her fault and was not, ultimately, unkind. Lord Ramsgate himself, Julian's father's old friend, was a different matter. He had come to Julian in February, when the engagement was announced, with a formal objection that was prepared, organized, and presented as though it were a legal document, rather than a personal preference. He had listed Cordelia's deficiencies by category: birth, fortune, social standing, the specific requirements of the ducal estate for a suitable match. He had delivered this to Julian in the library of Ramsgate House, with the confidence of a man who believed himself to be performing a genuine service. Julian had listened to the entire presentation. Then he had placed on the table between them Thomas Carey's comprehensive report on Cordelia's work, the 4 years of Ashton estate management, the creditor negotiations, the supply restructuring, the 14 months in Ashcroft Hollow, the school, the road accounts, the vestry governance proposal, the lending library, the surveying error that had been incorrectly charging 3 tenant farmers for a decade. He had placed beside it the amended stewardship document with its revised clause. He had placed beside that a letter from Alistair Webb, the Ashcroft magistrate, which was unsolicited and had arrived 2 days prior, testifying in Webb's characteristically plain language to the specific operational improvements Cordelia had made to the village's financial arrangements over 14 months. "She has been doing this work for 6 years," Julian said, "without a title, without credit, and without complaint. I am putting her name on it. If you believe the estate is better served by someone who can trace her grandmother's connection to an earl, but cannot find a discrepancy in a quarterly account, you are welcome to continue believing that, but you will not persuade me of it." Lord Ramsgate had looked at the documents for a long time. He was not, when it came to it, a stupid man. He was a man whose categories had been built early and held firmly, and what Julian had put in front of him was information that did not fit the categories. Information, moreover, that was documented. "You have made up your mind," he said finally. "I made it up in October," Julian said. "I came to you as a courtesy." Ramsgate had been quiet for a moment. Then, "She found the discrepancy in the Leeds account." "Yes," Julian said. Another silence. £44 recovered? "Yes." Ramsgate had looked at the Webb letter again. He had not said anything further about the unsuitability of the match. He had said, instead, and without warmth but also without contempt, "I hope she will manage Wrentham as well as she managed that village." It was not an endorsement. It was not meant to be. But it was a partial, private acknowledgement from a man who had spent his life moving his pieces by one set of rules. And it was the most Cordelia had expected from that quarter, and somewhat more than she had anticipated. The public reckoning came in June, 6 weeks after the wedding, at a meeting of the Wrentham Estate Trust, a formal gathering of the estate's principal investors and creditors, convened quarterly, at which the estate steward traditionally presented the accounts. The steward, Mr. Gerald Poole, was a decent man who had been with the estate for 6 years and who had, over the preceding 3 months, been working alongside Cordelia on a systematic review of every supply agreement currently in place. What they had found was not fraud precisely, but a pattern of accumulated inefficiency that had the same practical effect. 12 supply agreements that had not been renegotiated since Julian's father's tenure, 3 creditor arrangements with rates that had been standard in 1800 and were no longer competitive in 1817, and a wool merchant relationship that was the same Leeds firm Cordelia had flagged in 1815, now operating under a new contract that was marginally better than the old one, but still contained 2 clauses that gave the merchant unilateral flexibility on delivery scheduling, in a way that systematically disadvantaged the estate. Cordelia had identified all of this in writing. She had prepared a document, 63 pages, clearly organized, with every figure sourced to its original record, and every recommendation supported by comparative figures from at least 2 other estates, that she and Poole had reviewed together 3 times before presenting it. The trust meeting was held in the Wrentham House boardroom, a room with a long mahogany table and portraits of 3 previous dukes on the wall, and a quality of formal institutional weight that had been designed, she suspected, to make the people being looked at feel small. There were 11 men at the table, including Lord Ramsgate, a senior partner from the estate's banking firm, 2 wool merchants of independent standing, and the 3 principal creditors whose arrangements were under review. Cordelia sat at Julian's right hand with the 63-page document in front of her and did not look at the portraits. The steward, Poole, opened the formal business. He was nervous, and she knew it, and she had told him, that morning, that his function today was to verify, not to explain, and that she would do the explaining. He had looked profoundly relieved. She began with the wool merchant. She did not argue. She did not plead. She presented the figures, the original contract, the 1815 renegotiation, the revised contract, the 2 clauses, the delivery schedule data from the past 3 quarters, showing exactly how the flexibility clauses had been exercised, and what they had cost the estate in practical terms. She presented this in a sequence that moved from documented fact to documented fact without gap, and she presented it in the specific, unhurried manner of someone who knows the material completely and has no need to perform the knowing. The senior banking partner, a man named Cross who had been with the estate's banking arrangements for 20 years, leaned forward at the third table of figures and said, "Where did these delivery schedule records come from?" "From the estate's own dispatch records," Cordelia said. Cross-referenced against the merchant's invoicing dates. The discrepancy in column 3 represents 11 occasions over 3 quarters in which the delivery schedule clause was invoked by the merchant with less than 48 hours' notice, resulting in additional haulage costs borne by the estate. The figure is £412 over the period. £412, Cross repeated, in the tone of a man performing an arithmetic check. "Yes," she said. "I can walk through each occasion individually if that would be useful." The wool merchant whose contract was under review had gone very still at the far end of the table. She proceeded to the creditor arrangements. She presented the comparative rates. She presented the letters she had obtained from 2 neighboring estates, with their permission, showing the rates those estates were currently paying, neither of which she named, as she had given her word not to, but both of which she had obtained through Daniel Purvis's connections and Alistair Webb's quiet correspondence, and both of which demonstrated that the Wrentham arrangements were between £40 and £60 annually, above the current market rate on each account. £180 of recoverable annual margin across 3 accounts, plus the wool merchant revision, which at a revised rate would save the estate a projected £220 annually, £400 in total recovered margin per year. The room did not erupt. It went very quiet, in the particular way of rooms where something undeniable has been placed on a table, and everyone present is in the process of understanding that they will have to respond to it. Lord Ramsgate, at the far end of the table, was looking at the document in front of him with the expression of someone counting. He had received a copy 24 hours in advance, as all the trust members had. He had, she suspected, read it. Cross said, "These projections are based on renegotiation. Have any of the parties agreed to revise terms?" "2 of the 3 creditors have agreed in principle," Cordelia said. "The revised terms are proposed in the appendix. The 3rd is still under discussion." She paused, and then, because it was accurate, and because the room needed to understand the scope of what was being presented, "The supply agreement review is ongoing. I have identified 19 additional agreements that have not been reviewed since the previous Duke's tenure. My preliminary estimate is that the recoverable margin across those agreements, once reviewed, will be in the range of a further £200 to £400 annually. I will present the full review at the September meeting." Julian, beside her, did not speak. He did not need to. He had read the document, had reviewed every figure with her over 3 evenings at the library table, and had made 2 suggestions, both good ones, that she had incorporated. He was at the table because the table was his, and because he intended that the room should understand, beyond any possibility of ambiguity, that what was being presented here was the official position of the Wrentham estate, and not an informal recommendation. He turned, once, to Lord Ramsgate at the close of the presentation. Ramsgate met his eyes. Then Ramsgate turned to Cordelia and said, in the tone of a man completing a calculation he had begun in February, "The September meeting, you said." "Yes," she said. "I will be here," he said. It was not warmth, it was not apology, but it was a man who had come to this table, prepared to see one thing, and was leaving with the understanding that he had seen something else. After the meeting, when the room had emptied and Poole had gathered the documents, with the careful satisfaction of a man who had stood in a difficult room and come out well, Julian looked at Cordelia across the long table. "You told me in March," she said, before he could speak, "that you made your decision in October, that you knew." "Yes," he said. "I want to know," she said, "whether the Ramsgate objection gave you any hesitation." He considered this honestly, which she had always respected him for. "It clarified my commitment," he said. "It did not create hesitation." He paused. "You know what I was thinking, at the 3rd page of the presentation, when Cross asked about the records." "You were thinking about 2 a.m, she said. "The Leeds account." "I was thinking," he said, That you have been doing this since you were 18, and that I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure everyone in a room knows whose work they are looking at." She pressed one hand briefly against the table's surface, not from distress, but from the particular fullness of a thing that has arrived completely and requires a moment's acknowledgement. "That," she said, "is the right sentence." He came around the table to her, and there, in the Wrentham boardroom with the portraits of 3 previous dukes looking on, he took both her hands and kissed her with the quiet, unhurried certainty of a man who has been deciding something for a long time and has finally stopped deciding and simply acted. The private proposal, the true one, the one she kept, came 3 weeks earlier than the trust meeting, in the morning room at Wrentham House, on a Wednesday evening in late April, when they had been going through the preliminary accounts review together, and the fire had burned low, and the house had gone quiet around them. He had set down his pen, she had continued writing for a moment, finishing the note she was making, and then set down hers. "Not because it is convenient," he said. "Not because it fits the requirements my position imposes, or because my aunt believes it is the right arrangement, or because Thomas has expressed his approval in the only terms Thomas uses, which is to say by continuing to work at his usual pace without visible alarm." He paused. "Because you walked into my library at 10:30 at night and showed me a gap in a set of accounts that had been wrong for 8 months, and you showed it to me as though it were simply the obvious thing. Because you left without a letter, and I did not deserve one. Because you built a school in a village in Yorkshire without waiting for anyone to offer you the authority to do it. Because when I read Thomas's report in March and understood what I had failed to do, the only clear thought I had was that I intended to find you and ask, and that I would accept whatever answer you gave me." He looked at her. "I am asking," he said. She had thought about it, fully, with everything on the table, in the manner she trusted. It had not taken long. Some things, once examined completely, are simply clear. "Yes," she said, with the revised clause. He had looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has been profoundly, specifically relieved, and then he had laughed. A real laugh, unperformed and quiet, the kind she had not heard from him before, and she had felt, with complete certainty, that she had been right to stay in Ashcroft Hollow for a week, because the man who laughed like that was the man she was agreeing to, and he was exactly who she had thought he was. He did not straighten his cravat that evening. She did, and had done so consistently since their first proper dinner at Wrentham House in March, because it was crooked with a regularity that suggested it was the first thing he tied and the last thing he checked, and because no one else had apparently told him. She told him the second time with the precise, neutral directness she brought to other operational observations, and he had looked at her with that slight shift at the corner of his mouth and said, "How long has it been crooked? This evening?" "Approximately 40 minutes, she said. He did not say anything. He simply tilted his chin and let her fix it, and the smallness of the gesture, the trust of it, the quiet domestic completeness of it, had cost her more composure than the contract clause and the boardroom combined. The life they built was not a simple one, because they were not simple people, and the world they occupied was not a simple place. But it was a solid one, the way a well-built bridge is solid, not because nothing ever pressed on it, but because every element had been put in place correctly and tested before the next one was added. The Ashcroft Free School continued under Charlotte Pierce's directorship, funded by an annual grant from the Wrentham Estate Charitable Allocation that Cordelia had written into the budget in September of 1817, her first official act in her formalized role. Charlotte had negotiated the terms of her directorship with the estate solicitor, Geoffrey Hartwell, who had found the entire conversation unexpected and had left it, Cordelia understood from Julian's account, looking thoughtful in the way of a man who has been made to argue with someone considerably more capable than he anticipated. The school grew to 22 children by the following spring. Charlotte wrote to Cordelia quarterly, with a detailed account of its progress, the tone of which was affectionate and completely unsentimental. Daniel Purvis came to Wrentham House in the autumn of 1817, at Cordelia's invitation, to serve as an advisor on the supply chain review. He brought 40 years of wool trade experience and a complete unwillingness to accept a figure that did not add up, and he and Cordelia worked through the 19 outstanding supply agreements over 3 months in a manner that produced, by December, a final recoverable margin figure of £380 annually, within the projected range she had presented to the trust in June. Geoffrey Hartwell, the estate solicitor who had initially opposed the marriage in formal written terms and had been overruled completely, came to the estate in November with a matter involving the Wrentham entail that he framed, pointedly, as requiring the Duchess's review in addition to the Duke's. It was a small gesture, stiff in its delivery, and not particularly comfortable for anyone. It was also, Cordelia understood, the only form of acknowledgement Geoffrey Hartwell was structurally capable of producing, and she accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered, which was the spirit of a man making his way toward a position he had been wrong to resist. Their son, William Edward Ashford, arrived in the autumn of 1818, a solid, loud, and entirely opinionated infant, who had, from his first days, his father's dark hair, and his mother's particular manner of examining anything placed in front of him, thoroughly, without rushing, as though understanding it completely before reacting to it. Julian held him in the library on the first evening with the expression of a man holding something so important that the appropriate response had not yet been formulated, and Cordelia watched him from the chair by the fire and felt the completeness of it with the quiet certainty she trusted most. He was named for her father, partly, and for the continuity of something. Not a dukedom's machinery, though it served that purpose, but the specific line of attention that ran from Edward Ashton at his estate desk in Hertfordshire, to Cordelia at her schoolroom blackboard, to the library at 10:30, and the fugue that held its original true thing through every variation. William's first winter was spent being carried, with considerable determination, from room to room of Wrentham House, by a mother who continued to work with him on her hip, and a father who appeared in doorways at intervals to relieve the situation, and was rarely refused. The estate accounts for the first quarter of 1819 were notable. Later, for a small ink blot on the third page that had been there since February, when William had reached for the pen at a critical moment, Cordelia had kept the page. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. This had been true for as long as rooms had existed, and it would be true long after the specific rooms of Wrentham House had been repapered and reformed and handed to another generation. What was less common, what was, in the particular instance of Cordelia Ashford, née Ashton, the thing that made the difference, was that the person being overlooked had kept the record. Every figure, every agreement, every renegotiation, every correction. Her name was on it. It had always been on it. It was simply, finally, the name on the outside of the document as well. By the time William was 4 years old and had firmly established opinions about the estate's grain supply arrangements, which he communicated from the doorway of the estate office, in terms that combined his father's precision with his mother's directness, in a way that made Poole the steward look up with an expression of genuine alarm, the Wrentham estate had recovered and restructured its entire supply chain. The lending library in Ashcroft Hollow had become the model for 3 similar projects in neighboring villages, and Cordelia's annotated supply management framework, a set of principles and templates she had drafted for Poole's use and then expanded, carefully, over 2 years, had been formally adopted by 2 neighboring ducal estates, whose stewards had come to Wrentham to understand how the numbers had improved so substantially in so short a time. She had not published it under her name. She had put her name on the correspondence that transmitted it, which was sufficient, and Julian had ensured that everyone who received it understood where it came from. On an evening in October 1819, in the library where it had effectively begun, Cordelia was working at the table when Julian came in from the estate grounds, still wearing his riding coat, and stood for a moment looking at her in the way he had, which was the way of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for and has not forgotten the 3 months it took. She looked up, his cravat was crooked. She set down her pen and rose and crossed the room, and he tilted his chin with the complete, quiet trust of someone who knows they are being looked after, and she straightened it, and held it for a moment, and he covered her hand with his before she could step back. William, from the corridor, announced himself with the particular combination of footsteps and inquiry that meant he had escaped the nursery maid again, and had a question about something he had found in the garden. In a moment, Julian called, without looking away from Cordelia. She was already smiling, and he was watching her, and the library held them the way it had held the 2 o'clock accounting 4 years before. The fire, the papers on the table, the rain that had begun again outside. Everything she had built and survived and carried to this room was in it. Everything she had refused to become less than was there. She brought everything she had, and she put it to work. And this was what it had come to: a room that knew her name, and a man who had searched 4 counties in winter to find her, and the life they had built with the same care she had always given to everything, thoroughly, without rushing, beginning with a single true thing, and carrying it through every variation, until there was no question left that it held.